Reading 80 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2. Quaramide, Ugle, June 16, 1945. The meaning of force in the work. Let us speak about force. When you do a thing too long, you have no force. Some people have difficulty in separating their idea of force from the idea of physical force. But there are many kinds of force that act on us. From the work point of view, when a man is completely asleep, he has no force. That is, he has no work force. He is then in life. All force is made through some form of self-knowledge. I mean that all work force is made in this way. You can be enormously powerful in a physical sense, and yet from the work point of view, you have no force. In trying to understand how force is made in us, we have to study, first of all, what makes us lose force. But again, this is not starting far enough back, because people who simply understand force as meaning physical force will not understand what this force that the work speaks about means. The force that the work speaks about is what keeps us awake. And here again, it is difficult to understand what this means if one has always lived one's life completely identified with oneself, and so completely asleep. Of course, you do not know that you have no force if you are completely asleep. If you are simply a function of your personality, if you are identified with what you are in life, you will not understand what force means in the work sense. Let us try to speak as simply as possible about force. We have different centers in us. Each center requires a different kind of energy, or force, for it to work properly. There is, for example, force in moving center. A man may have great energy connected with his moving center, and no energy for his intellectual center. Now, if such a man uses all his force, let us say, in moving center, he will not understand what it means to have force for the intellectual center. Forces or energies in us are of different kinds. If you get hold of this idea that there are different kinds of energies and forces in us, you will be better able to understand the more complete teaching about force that the work gives. The idea of balanced man that I often think dominates our work, or should do so, is that of a man who has force that can pass at different times into different centers, because balanced man is a man who can use all his centers at the appropriate times. A one-centered man, a one-sided man, employs his force, such as he has, mechanically, chiefly in one center. But the work says that we must eventually come to the point of being able to use all the centers with their right energies. Otherwise, we remain ungrown, undeveloped. We have 5 ordinary centers: the intellectual center, the emotional center, the sex center, the moving center, and the instinctive center. A full man has at the right times force in all these 5 centers, and the force is quite different in each case. You cannot, for example, use intellectual force for lifting weights. Quite different force has to be employed. Now, the balancing of the machine, the balancing of the centers, depends on the right appropriating of force among these different centers. A man and a woman ordinarily live a very one-sided existence, using, as it were, the same quality of force, so they get tired. But there are other centers, other forces that can be used when one is tired in one center. The trouble is that when we are tired in one center, we are tired, and that is the end of it. It is like walking up and down the same path. But when you are tired in one center, you are not necessarily tired in another center. I may find myself mentally tired and unable to think or write for the time being, but if I get into my moving center, let us say, I find that there is plenty of force there. However, we all have a pattern of life to which we stick to rigidly. Too rigidly. and which confines us to a very narrow range of experience of meaning. Every center has its own different kind of meaning. Every center conducts meaning, but we tend to live in one pattern of meaning and do not realize that we can have other meanings that are waiting for us in some other center or part of a center that we have not used for a long time. On one occasion, I was talking to Mr. Ouspensky, who said that people do not study how to pass from one center to another, or from one part of a center to another part of a center. He said that a certain kind of effort is necessary to pass from one center to another, and that if we could find the way for ourselves to do this, we should have far more energy, far more force. He went on to give one method that he had used, which I cannot give you here, but later on he said that the first thing to understand is that it is possible to pass from one center to another, or from one part of the same center to another, and that unless a person understands this, he does not realize the possibilities in him. I think he meant that not realizing that some center or part of a center can have force. We tend to feel exhausted when we need not be exhausted. The reason being that we live in a kind of rigid pattern of life and always do the same thing over and over again. That is, we live in very small parts. At that time, Mr. Ouspensky was talking a great deal about thinking differently. He said that supposing a man begins to think differently, he will at once get force because his thinking will change from one part of the intellectual center to another part. But most people do not understand what it means to think differently from the way they are always thinking. I can give you an example. Suppose you have noticed that you are thinking of a person in a certain way, quite mechanically, as you always do, and these thoughts give you no force. Suppose even that you have become sufficiently sensitive to your inner life to realize that you are really losing force by thinking of this person in this unusual way. In this usual way, Now suppose that you apply the work to yourself at this moment and put yourself into this person's position, or even go so far as to think that you are this person yourself and that you perhaps are like him. This will change your thinking, and then you will get into a higher part of the intellectual center, and then suddenly you may find that you have force. You are thinking in a new way. Now this is an example of gaining force by applying the work to yourself. After a time in the work, you will begin to get tired of your customary thoughts, the thoughts that you ordinarily go with every day. But you must remember that you can think in a new way about everything, and here you must begin by including yourself. It is a very marvelous experience to realize that you can think differently both about other people and about yourself, and about your past and present life. The trouble is that we simply accept our thoughts and believe that they are quite right and that they are the only possible thoughts that we can have. Why, you can think differently in a million ways. Have you noticed the rigid man, the rigid woman, who always thinks in the same set way, always says the same thing, always expresses the same opinion, like a parrot? Perhaps you may have, but I advise you first of all to notice yourself in this respect. Are you a parrot? Now do you understand that you can think quite differently, and that you are simply using every day only one line of thinking, where there are a million lines of thinking? Let us say that you are full of prejudices, crystallized attitudes, smugness, etc., with which you thoroughly agree, with which you are fully satisfied. Now, if you are such a person, can you expect to change, to undergo any inner development? Such a person will always be the same person, always say the same thing, always express the same standpoints, take all experience in a stereotyped way. He or she is no good from the work point of view. Why? Because being quite satisfied does not lead to self-change. The great key to self-change lies in observing oneself, observing how one talks, what opinions one constantly repeats, what one constantly condemns in others, what one is so proud of, and so on. You cannot change otherwise, because if you take yourself for granted as being all right, you cannot change. What has to be changed in this work, as has been so often said, what has to be changed in this work, as has been so often said? It is you yourself, who must change. You have got to see that you are nothing but a mechanical parrot. You yourself must see that you always say the same things and do the same things and behave in the same way. That is why the work says that unless you can begin to realize your mechanicalness, you can never really remember yourself. And this is exactly why, if you take yourself for granted and think that you yourself can be the starting point, and that as you are quite acceptable and right, with the right ideas, the right forms of life, the right attitudes, and so on, you will never be able to change, and you will never know what this work is about. But if you begin to have a sincere, observing eye, and this is impossible unless you feel the work emotionally, and your own lack of knowledge and being, then after a time you will feel rather unhappy about the state of yourself, about the kind of person you are. This was pointed out recently in several papers, but I am pointing it out again now as I notice that some people cannot take this in. They start from themselves as being excellent as they are. Life has built up in us all certain kinds of people. This is our life experience. This is the personality. You may be very good at making shirts, or knitting socks, or gardening, or being a doctor, or being an engineer, or being a good mother, or a good father, or a fine soldier, or a good typist, or an efficient clerk, or a good businessman, or a good anything you like in life, or a good wife, or a good husband, or anything you like in regard to doing your duty as taught you and so acquired. How do you escape from all this? This is your prison. Of course, if you do not want to escape from all this and feel satisfied, then there is no reason why you should do this work or try to study it. That is why I said in recent papers that if you are quite satisfied with yourself as you are, you really cannot do this work, and it is no use your studying it, because your buffers, your pride, your self-conceit, and your vanity and so on will be so great that nothing can shift in you. That is exactly why it is so difficult to teach this idea of a further development that esotericism speaks about, this second education in which personality has to become passive. In fact, you have to realize gradually that you are absolutely nobody, nothing but a kind of invention. This again is a great difficulty, and if a man or a woman cannot observe himself or herself from the work point of view, they will not be able to shift from themselves, so they will have no work, no extra force, no work force, but only life force. Life force is that force that makes personality and keeps it going day by day, and this is absolutely necessary for the first development, the first education of a human being, his or her first contact with the earth. But there is another force called work force, the force of esoteric teaching, the force that you find spoken about in every page of the Gospels, the force that leads to the rebirth of a man or woman. Let me remind you that this work is about transformation of being. That means becoming a new man or woman. This work can eventually conduct to you, if you receive it and think it sufficiently important, an entirely new valuation of yourself and an entirely new realization of your meaning in life. You will then see you are nothing as you are. This indeed is the whole point of the work, because the work is not about life and what it has made you, save indirectly, but it is about this further transformation that a man or a woman, having fulfilled their duties in life, can eventually undergo. But they cannot undergo this transformation unless they feel that they have come to the end of things, to the end of duty, to the end of their own excellence, to the end of science, to the end of all worldly knowledge, and yet feel that there must be something else apart from what life has made them by birth and training. I remind you here of a work phrase: life cannot be explained by life. Life cannot be explained in terms of itself. Nature cannot be explained in terms of herself. And you cannot explain yourself in terms of yourself. Ask yourself, how do you think? How do you move? Can you explain it? However, most people do not trouble themselves with thoughts of this kind, and a great many people think that such thoughts are extremely morbid. They advise you to consult a doctor. But if you have such thoughts, you have already the possession of magnetic center, which is a sign of being, because a man who has magnetic center, even if he has done very little in life, is even then superior in his being to a man who is, say, a great success in life and attributes everything to himself and has seen no mystery. Now, all workforce starts from magnetic center in a certain sense. You cannot get new force without that which magnetic center leads into eventually. This feeling of mystery leads you to a certain point. You cannot get this workforce unless you feel something else apart from the visible world and visible life, from spades and bricks and accounts and so on. If you are quite content with your food, your income, your house, your children, your excellent disposition, your immaculate virtue, your respectability, your fine career, and so on, and your prowess in general, then you have no magnetic center. Sometimes when reading the newspapers, I wonder whether anyone has any magnetic center nowadays in high positions, in politics and so on. It seems to me somehow that everyone thinks that he can do, and all people want is more regulations, more rules, more science, to produce a perfect world. In my own case, as a comparatively young man, I realized that I did not know anything. I met doctors. I became a doctor myself, somewhat against my will. And yet, all the time this feeling that I really knew nothing persisted in me. Now, a man asleep in life, by which I mean a man who has no magnetic center, will be quite content to become a doctor, a scientist, a general, and so on. His force will be derived from life entirely, from his successes, and he will rub his hands and tell you that he did all this or all that. This is tedious, but usual. Of course, such a man or such a woman will not think for a moment that he or she is all the time attributing everything to themselves. They do not see that life has made them. They will think themselves very good people, excellent people, admirable people, people doing their duty, and so on. Yet I must insist on continuing to point out to you all that this is exactly where the dividing line comes between a man or a woman who can understand this work and a man or a woman who can never understand it. It takes a very exceptional person to admit, whatever his reputation in life may be, that he knows nothing really, and that he feels himself to be nothing. Some kettles are very small and are soon filled. But in this work we are seeking people who wish to find something else than what life has made them. Now let us come back again to the subject of force, because all that has been said is connected with the idea of making force in all work sense. In the work sense. Now, no one can make any force in the work sense if he is completely identified, satisfied with himself, vain and proud, content with himself as he is. It is quite useless. Such people derive the feeling of themselves from their life achievement. You can only make force in the work sense by not being identified with yourself. Now I will try to explain more carefully the point of this paper, which is connected with the other papers recently written. You can come under a new range of forces which are very wonderful and which can give you very strange and curious feelings of power, provided that you do not identify with all that you have done in life. Of course, you have not done all that you have done in life. It has been done to you by circumstances, outside forces, outside necessity. And if you derive your feeling of yourself from all that you have done in this sense, you will never be able to get this strange force of the work acting on you. Look at your pride. Look at your vanity. Look at your meritoriousness. Look at your self-satisfaction. Look at your virtuousness. Look at your respectability. Look at everything of this kind that life has built up in you. And let me ask you this question. Do you gain your feeling of yourself from all that? Or have you something in you that rather dislikes it and feels it is not really you? If so, you can begin to get force from the work, but you must increase this feeling of dislike, of not accepting yourself as life has made you. You must not get your feeling of I, your feeling of yourself from all that, if you want to change, because as long as you hold on to all that and take yourself as that, what a fine fellow I am, you will be identifying with your personality, and probably chiefly with your false personality. And as long as this takes place, as long as this is your internal situation day by day and minute by minute, there is no place in which the work can enter you, because at every moment you are reinforcing this vain, conceited feeling of yourself, derived from what you were or are in life. But speaking technically, as long as life is your neutralizing force, as long as life is the force that makes you go, makes you do everything, it keeps the personality active, and that, of course, includes especially the false personality, and keeps the real part of you that can grow, essence, passive. The work is about bringing in a new neutralizing or third force whose ultimate object is to change this relationship of essence to personality. In fact, reverse it altogether. Many foolish things are said about giving up your life. Many foolish people go into monasteries and so on, but I am not talking about this. This way, this work, lies in life, and the secret is not to identify with what you were or are in life. You have to start all over again. The better kind of person you were in life, the better your possibilities. If you understand what it means to make personality passive, because it is through making personality passive that essence, or the real part of you, can grow, because personality is like the meat in the egg, and essence is like the germ spot that can grow at the sacrifice of the meat of the egg. Now, all workforce is derived from the realization of this tremendous idea that the work teaches that a new birth is possible. You have perhaps, all of you, noticed how many people who have been in contact with this work are no longer quite the same as before. They find that in the atmosphere of the work, it is very little use to bring in life experience from personality, or especially from false personality. They find they cannot boast of what they have done. They find they cannot boast of what they have done in quite the same way as people do in life. The gradual sacrifice of this meat of personality so that the germ of essence can grow is one reason why the work atmosphere must be created amongst you all. An atmosphere in which we can really laugh at ourselves sometimes. Yes, but can you laugh at yourself? Even the slight change that can take place in people who have a fairly good attitude to the work is often very remarkable. Yes, but why does this happen? It happens because the atmosphere of the work is different from the atmosphere of life. Technically, the third force of life which keeps personality active, and essence passive, is slightly changed, and some parts of personality begin to be sacrificed. And owing to this, essence begins to grow. So people become more real to one another, because if we were all more in essence than we are at present, everything would become much more real, much more genuine, much more simple, much more true, and much more good. When you try to increase what you have been, and to feel bigger and stronger and more powerful, more important, you are going in the very reverse direction to this work. Then you will get no force in the work sense. Such a state means that you are very identified with yourself, with your personality, which ascribes everything to itself. But you will not get workforce, as I said, from this identification with yourself. You only get workforce through non-identifying, through self-observation, and through dissolving these pictures, these ideas, this wonderful, proud imagination about yourself. The reason for this is quite simple. What prevents the two higher centers that are continually working in us, the higher mental center and the higher emotional center, from transmitting their force to us? They cannot get through to us owing to our self-admiration, our personality. All workforce comes indirectly from these two higher centers, which are at a higher level of being than we are, a level beyond our personality. Remember that the work teaches that they are fully developed and that they are transmitting messages to us the whole time, but we cannot hear them owing to our state of sleep. Is not this an extraordinary idea? Does it not seem a fantastic idea that there is something in us that is trying to change us the whole time and cannot reach us owing to this blocking, this blackout, due to the personality, but more particularly to the overweening false personality? Now, if a man begins to work on himself through his own self-observation, if he begins to observe his inner sleep, his vanity, if he begins to observe his meritoriousness, if he begins to observe his negative emotions, if he begins to observe his pictures of himself, if he begins to observe his buffers and prejudices, his mechanical opinions, his stereotyped talking, his chattering, his evil talking, he or she will then begin to be separated from these things, because if you can observe a thing, you are no longer it. Do you understand? Which is the first step in this separation that the work teaches. I could add many other things here that one has to observe, but the ultimate issue is this. If you are identified with yourself as you are, if you are taking all your thoughts as real, and will not see that you have to separate yourself from many, many bad moods, bad self-feelings, you will get nowhere in this work. The method of this work is through non-identifying with yourself. You must learn not to identify with yourself by observing yourself and separating. What is yourself? Yourself is psychological. Yourself is psychic. Yourself is whatever you like to call it. But it is not physical, not your body. It belongs to what you are conscious of. Are you going to put your consciousness into an evil thought or an evil mood? Are you going to put your consciousness into self-satisfaction, self-glorification, or are you going to put your consciousness into feeling that you are always right and know best? Do you not see that unless you observe yourself, you cannot notice where you place your consciousness? I find myself with many feelings, many moods, many thoughts that come to me mechanically that I do not put my consciousness into. For instance, I do not put my feeling of I into hate or the feeling of hopelessness. I do not consent to them. I do not go with them. Now, if you do this, you will get workforce, but if you are simply yourself, taken for granted, totally identify with yourself, you will get no workforce at all, because you will be under the third force of life, and not the third force of the work. There is spirit and matter, to use phrases that do not belong to our system. A man must develop spiritually, and this means in the work, psychologically. You all are given bodies, or different sizes, and that is not your fault, so do not pride yourselves on them. But the work is talking about a psychological inner development where truth counts for so much. Suppose you are trying to build up this second body that we all have to build up in this work, a psychological body. This body is based on truth, on sincerity. Now suppose you have a negative emotion against someone. This means at once that you will have wrong connections in your psychological body that survives after death, if it can. So you have a psychological body all wrongly connected, because all negative states make you lie. If you notice, when you are negative, you are always lying. Have you yet got the strength to see that you are lying by tasting negative emotion? don't you begin to understand that this work is to build up truth in us, not moral truth in the orthodox sense, not truth from a particular kind of orthodox belief, but real truth through inner sincerity. That is why the work starts with self-observation, uncritical and absolutely sincere. This builds up gradually in us a transmitting instrument, a psychological instrument that can conduct the influences of the higher centers, because the higher centers that are always working in us can only reach us when there is truth in us. For that reason, many of us have to go through what you might call very disturbing experiences to get rid of our false personality, our meritoriousness, our vanity, our prejudices. Prejudice is quite useless. It conducts nothing. Meritoriousness, feeling, is even worse. To ascribe to yourself your excellence in any form will make it impossible for higher centers to come through to you. I would advise some of you who call yourselves Christians to read carefully the Sermon on the Mount and consider what it means as far as you can. But to resume the paper, you will get no force in the work sense unless you work against personality and do not identify with the kind of person that you take yourself for granted as being, because you are not what you think you are. This is one paper on force, on work force. All work force is derived by going against yourself, by going against your natural, mechanical reaction at the moment. But every man or woman must have a private feeling of the work in their hearts, in their minds, so that even when they are alone, they do not consent to mechanical negative thoughts, and externally do not talk mechanically about other people in this work. If this is sincerely done, then we can produce perhaps a real work atmosphere, finally to which everyone contributes, and if it drops, people will ask themselves sincerely what they said, what they did, why force has apparently leaked.